Thank you, Steve. It's always good to come back to Waitara Church. Fond memories of being here and being welcomed, and your partnership with Anglicare is appreciated. If you can have the Hebrews reading open in front of you, because I'm not going to be reading all the verses as I go through. But it might have struck you there's this bizarre reference in verse 2 to angels. But going back to the beginning of Hebrews, angels are described in chapter 1 as ministering spirits who are sent to serve God's people. And then here in verse 2 of chapter 13, it indicates that we might have encountered an angel without realising it. I think that's a bit bizarre. But there's examples of that happening in the Bible. It also takes me back to about 40 years ago. I was trekking in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and I had a fairly major problem. And out of nowhere, this man appeared, and he knew my need, and he helped me, and I'm stunned. I think I'd met 2 people in a whole day's walking on this remote trail, and I looked up to thank him, and he was gone. There's a fairly narrow track with a very steep fall-off on each side, so there's not many places you can go but on the track. So I dropped my pack and I ran to catch up to him, but he was gone. An angel? Well, whether an angel or not, he knew my need and he helped me, and I was thankful. Now, the immediate context of our reading is Hebrews 12, which describes that as followers of Jesus, we coexist with thousands upon thousands of angels in festive community. There's a heavenly city with God as judge over all. Jesus is there. By his blood shed, he's cleansed people for himself, and we're referred to in verse 23 as the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven. There's quite a bit about angels in Hebrews, and they're not all in joyful assembly around the throne. Sometimes the ministering spirits come to serve God's people, and maybe that was my experience, I'm not sure. But chances are you've been ministered to by an angel and you're just unaware of it. But be thankful for God's care. Anyway, with this backdrop of thousands of angels, it's said that we're receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Get a glimpse of the heavenly city if you read Revelation 21. And so there in chapter 12, we're urged to be thankful and to worship God with reverence and awe. These verses give us the context of chapter 13, that heaven is happening as we sit here. It is a reality. That the kingdom, the heaven is the kingdom. That so far we've just dipped our toes into a vast ocean of reality. Yet we know its goodness. We know Jesus, and we do well to heed the warning not to refuse God's offering. So today I hope that you'll be encouraged with a vision of heaven to live well. A vision that lets that supernatural reality infuse our life. That we are citizens of heaven now. We are living under Jesus' rule now. And as we do that, we give others a glimpse of a better life, a better way of living. So let's stride forward in love. Hanging out with an angel might be pretty special if you knew it was happening. But loving one another as brothers and sisters, that is extraordinary. Kindness to strangers, having compassion towards those in prison and those suffering, that is extraordinary. Being other person-centred requires effort, but that's the life of the kingdom that we're called to. And it's an exciting life. Verse 1, keep loving your fellow Christians. Some of us are harder to love than others, but, let's try and be more lovable, but let's flood others with that generous love. In verse 2, the actual word hospitality here actually means love of the stranger. It's not about having friends over for lunch, but that's also a good thing to do. In the ancient world, travel was dangerous. Hotels were sparse. And apparently upon reaching a city, often a traveller would wait outside the city gates, hoping for an invitation by someone in the city to be invited in, somewhere to stay. And there's apparently a cultural expectation that if you were going to host a stranger in your home, you'd prepare a lavish meal, you'd provide rest. And the onus was for the traveller, for the stranger, not to stay more than 2 days. We've probably all had people who have outstayed their welcome. I'm not sure about you, but I have. So when the Bible encourages us to be hospitable, is to love the people that God brings across our path. And dare I say, to look for ways to love the stranger. You know, we can go around with blinkers on and we don't see opportunities, but pray that God will open our eyes and we'll see, and we'll have the courage to take opportunities to love others and give them kingdom glimpses as we do so. And in verse 3, it speaks about not forgetting the prisoners and those who are mistreated. In first century Roman Empire, you know, there were people in prison who'd done wrong. There were prisoners of war. There was also Christians who'd been arrested for their faith. Either way, this scripture doesn't differentiate. It says we should be empathetic to the difficult circumstances of others. You might grab a leaflet from the table out there that I've got. There's a beautiful story of Wal, the prison chaplain, and AJ, a prisoner who became a Christian. And there's a video that accompanies that. Just a wonderful story of someone in prison for a violent crime finding restoration. So verse 3, continue to remember those in prison as if we were together with them in prison. That's really putting ourselves in other people's shoes, isn't it? And those who are ill-treated as if we ourselves were suffering. That's empathy. And Jesus' empathy characterised his life, his identification with us as humanity, his care for those in need, his deep love such that he would give his life to spare us judgment and death and be joined into that heavenly community. And yet Elon, somebody, said on the Joe Rogan podcast, if you ever listened to the Joe Rogan podcast, Elon said that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. And the context here was the need for the weaker members of society to be weeded out, that we should not be kinder than nature, which does weed out. Well, I prefer to take my cues from Jesus, and I hope you would too. Anyway, let me encourage you, don't wait for an angel to visit. Be extraordinary with your love for each other, your love for the stranger, to those in prison, those who are suffering, to let that love characterise your life. Your food collection, your everyday English classes, donations, other ways that you might partner with Anglicare and other organisations, each give opportunity for you to show that sort of love that we're called upon to give. Being content is something that we should all be working on. The transition from verses 1 to 3 to verse 4 is a sudden jump from empathy towards others to the temptations of self-indulgence with regard to sex and money, and our response to leadership. And our response can either build up or undermine community. And so in verse 4, we come across the issue of sexual immorality. Sex is a wonderful gift of God for sexual relations inside marriage, whether it be, that can be spoiled, whether it be by a married person or a single person, improper use of sex, messing with God's intention. And I add to this pornography, which is insidious, but it's the same thing. All of these things add to the brokenness that we carry around. And going down any of these rabbit holes, we just get lost in the darkness. So I encourage you to work through that one. God just does judge sexual immorality, it says here, but I also want you to consider how Jesus related to the people of his day. When he is relating to the sinners, the tax collectors, the prostitutes, he loved them. He loved the people on the margins, whereas the religious leaders of the day scorned them and judged them. Verses 5 and 6 speak of this contentedness, and it's hard to be contented when you feel lonely. Hard to be contented. Next issue is money. But the promise here of God is that never will he leave you, never will he forsake you. And so we say with confidence, the Lord is my helper, and that's increasingly understood as we learn to lean on God. Now, the church is often seen as a judgmental group of people, by people in society. I think encouragement here is to model God's way of living, to be a beacon of that, but also a shelter to those who struggle, to show that compassion. That vision of heaven, I think, helps us to keep that focus. In verse 5, being content with money comes up, and that doesn't prohibit us from improving our financial situation. We need money. Life in Sydney is expensive, but will we use our money for good? I grew up in a fairly wealthy family, and yet my father worried about his money right until the last week of his life. That worry was etched into my mind, and I think it guarded me against love of money even before I became a Christian, but even more so since I became a Christian. And my work in Indigenous communities and with refugees just reminds me again and again how fortunate I am, how wealthy I am, and my responsibility to be generous to others. And so, as Marty said, prayer doesn't happen, you've got a plan to pray. Similarly, generosity, that's something I think we need to resolve, and we need to plan how to be generous. And to remind ourselves that whatever we have is the Lord's, that has been entrusted to us to bless others. And for reasons of inheritance or income, each of us will have to grapple with our relationship with money individually. The level of generosity that we're willing to practice. And for me, the way I try and keep myself grounded is thinking, well, what sort of legacy am I going to leave my children? A lot of people think the legacy I want to leave my children is to, pay the deposit for their house. I want to leave a legacy of my children that I'm a citizen of heaven. I'm modelling generosity, and particularly to those on the margins. If your legacy is simply wealth for your children, where does being a witness for Jesus and modelling Jesus come in? That just helps me keep grounded. So this vision of heaven, I think, helps us to use our money well, as well as our sexuality. And the other temptation, interestingly, is how we respond to leadership. In verse 7 and verse 17, you can see there's comments on that. And in 27 years of ministry, I've worked under a variety of leaders, and like any of us, they've had strengths and weaknesses. And along the way, those of you who know me a bit better will know that, there's been a few clashes along the way. But one thing I've learned in verse 17 is that leaders have been appointed by God to watch over the congregation, and they'll be required to give an account to the Lord. And remembering that helps me to think they've got more skin in the game. And I look back on occasions where I've been a burden and not a joy to church leaders, and I wish I could rewind and do better. Nowadays, I still have strong opinions, probably stronger than when I was young. But while I express my opinions to the bishop and the archbishop, and sometimes I feel like they listen and they agree with me, sometimes I walk away frustrated. But I'm keen not to be a burden to them. I want to encourage them, I want to support them, I want to bring joy to their life and ease to their ministry rather than a burden. And maybe that's helpful for you to think through too. I'm fortunate. I'm in 4 churches out of 5 in August, 4 different churches. I've got no idea about the leadership dynamics in those churches. So I can come in and say things generic, but just an encouragement towards godliness for all of us. Jesus is Lord. In verse 8, he's described as the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that brings together all of what's been said previously in Hebrews, brings together all that has been happening in the Old Covenant, the ceremonies, the rituals that marked the Old Covenant, the high priest and the Holy of Holies, the sacrifice of animals outside the camp, the burning of the animals outside the camp. Jesus, our high priest, whose life started in a feed shop, whose life continued as a homeless wanderer, whose life, he died outside the city gate. A lot of connections there. Forsaken that we might never be forsaken. And then from verse 13, it brings it home. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city. Sydney, Waitara are not enduring. But we're looking for the city that is to come. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name. I don't think we think about heaven often enough. We're so caught up in the busyness of life, aren't we? Is that your situation? A vision of heaven helps us, I think, to live well. To forego the distractions of this non-enduring city that we live in. To forego, not begrudgingly, but with thanksgiving and praise, because our vision is the future, city of heaven. In verse 23 of chapter 12, our names are written in heaven. We are members of that heavenly city now. I think that's pretty amazing. It's humbling. I think it's a good grounding for us. And if you think it's all too hard, verses 20 and 21 is a prayer for us to be enabled by Jesus to be faithful. Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus Christ, that great shepherd of the sheep, may he equip you with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.